60 years, clients have returned to Jetcraft because of our proven results in aircraft sales, acquisitions and trades. Our team of experts span the globe, providing local insight for every stage of your transaction. We have one of the largest and most diverse inventories in the industry, and with our worldwide network and industry connections, we are the difference between getting an aircraft and getting your aircraft.
3, 2, 1.
Here we go!
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the Corporate Jet Investor Town Hall. This week is an exciting one. We're going to be looking at what can go wrong and what are the things you should look out for. Delighted to have 4 experts around the world coming to us from Hong Kong. We have Paul Jebley from Pillsbury. Paul needs no introduction, long-time aircraft finance specialist, and he also, in his spare time, has a foreign corrupt practice. Sorry, did I misread that? Spends a lot of time looking at the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Paul, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing, Al? Thanks for having me again. Hi, everyone.
Thanks for being had. It's great to have you on. Paul, you've spoken about this in the past. This year, we've seen a lot of sort of worrying signs for people involved in aviation. Do you see it as a particularly high-risk industry?
I have, and interestingly, the last time that I spoke about it in front of a large open audience was at your conference in 2019 in London. Now, of course, a lot has happened since then, including the sort of intervening zombie apocalypse. But at that time, part of the thesis was that the U.S. authorities, namely the Department of Justice and its foreign allies, and the Securities and Exchange Commission, where relevant, were intending on bringing business aviation very much back into their proverbial line of fire or under their proverbial magnifying glass. And during that presentation, which, by the way, is online, it's on the CGI website and it's on YouTube as well. I highly recommend everyone take some time to watch it because I'm not going to go through it all here, but it does go through in about 20 minutes everything you kind of need to know, and it's entitled, I think it was called "How to Stay Out of Jail" or "Get Out of Jail Free Card." But I mean, focusing on FCPA risk in private aviation, I do think that the risks today are higher than ever because of the very fact that the secondary market trading in aircraft cross-border at the moment is certainly higher than I've ever seen, and I believe arguably higher than ever. And it's those transactions, and it's the very cross-border nature of business aviation and just what I call a confluence of factors that are inherent in this industry, which rewards hyper-aggressive marketing and innately naturally deals in emerging markets where the risks are quite heightened. And to be honest with ourselves, we do need to be aware of this because we present a target-rich environment for the U.S. enforcement agencies and other enforcement agencies as well. But I focus on FCPA in business aviation.
And I think it's interesting. To start with, it is a great video. I actually watched it yesterday, and I'd like to point out that the jokes were not sanctioned by us. If someone wants to sue you based on it, please go direct to Paul. It's not worth coming for us, including one of the people who's speaking in a minute. One of the things I think was really interesting, and I do remember you saying this and pointing it out, and history's proven you right on this. But also, it is worth worrying about the US, isn't it? No matter where you are in the world, the arm stretches a long way.
Yeah, that's right. The US jurisdictional means in this subject matter reaches quite far. And again, in that presentation, there's a long list of examples, but there is one catch-all which relates to sort of instrumentality of US commerce, which can be US mail or where people usually get caught up is the use of United States dollars, either clearing or just their use as well. And part of what makes this, I call it an innate risk, is because we're dealing cross-border constantly, and in some business cultures, the norms of doing business in those cultures, while they may be permissible there, are completely adverse to the established rules under the FCPA, which is now, I believe it's now 42 years old. There's been hundreds of enforcement actions, billions of dollars of fines, and interestingly, just going back to the history, one of the very first enforcement actions under the FCPA concerned private aviation, and certainly that wasn't the only one. There's been, I stopped counting, before the pandemic, but I think there's been 10 enforcement actions in total. We don't need to get into details, but they involved potential jail time. They involved massive fines for private aviation industry participants for behavior that at the time really was, foreign corrupt practices, but has since been remedied.
Would you say there's a trend for organizations generally, not just the DOJ, Department of Justice, or the SEC? Do you think it's the trend is compliance is no longer negotiable across the board, whether it's sanctions, it's anti-money laundering, or it's FCPA? Well,
yeah, absolutely. I mean, my focus tends to be on FCPA, but and I talk about it as Team America, world police, trying to save American business from the tyranny of the foreign corrupt, and therefore level the playing field internationally. And it is done through the all-powerful Department of Justice, and where there's publicly traded securities, companies with publicly traded securities in the U.S. involve the SEC. But they also do work with their international counterparts, A, and then B, their international counterparts also stand on their own. So in the United Kingdom, in Hong Kong, we've seen enforcement action targeted directly at private aviation, and those aren't U.S. driven. So by all means, while it is Team America World Police, it's every jurisdiction, particularly the ones where the business practices aren't, per se questionable by their nature, are looking at these types of matters from an enforcement perspective as well.
With the FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, it tends to be the bigger names. It tends to be large companies, large aircraft manufacturers, large engine manufacturers who we see and hear about. If you're a small boutique firm with 2 or 3 professionals, do you need to worry about it as much?
Yeah, absolutely. So the reason for that, and the DOJ does, as I mentioned earlier, does consider this to be a target-rich environment, because frankly it is. And they do not have the bandwidth to go after every trespass. It's impossible. And so they do tend to go for ones that do either they're particularly egregious, or they serve a deterrence matter for the wider industry as well. So they absolutely do not pull the trigger on everything that comes across their desk. But it's also not true that they only target the big boys and girls, though the big boys and girls do have the ability to pay the big boy and girl fines as a consequence of what came out a few years ago from the then director, Sally Yates, what was called the Yates Memo, made it very clear there was an intention to go after individuals as well. So if you're talking about big fish versus little minnow, they frankly go after both, and they look to make they look to make an example of both. And the consequences are, like I said, billions of dollars, jail terms. You do not want any of this. So that's why it's important for everybody. And again, watch that presentation, because part of what I talk about, and in the slides as well, is one of the best defenses is showing that you have things like a gifts policy. and that you have, as an institution, thought about compliance, and that you keep records, particularly when it comes to gifts.
And actually, that's something worth doing. These compliance policies, you should also have a sanctions compliance policy. And none of this is fun, but it's worth having if something goes wrong.
None of this is fun. It's not particularly expensive to put into place. This isn't something that people like I or David or Dimitri or anyone else get particularly rich off of. They are, for the most part, boilerplate, but it's good to have them in place, and that's the most you can do for the least. And then otherwise, having your staff, particularly ones that are frontline, particularly ones that are dealing with foreign individuals, have an awareness of things like what is a foreign official under the FCPA, and why is it so incredibly wide-ranging? So then when you start to look at it through that lens, you see that you really come to see that we are playing in an absolute minefield for enforcement, and a pound of knowledge, as they say.
We've got a few. Janine Inerelli, who's just reminded me that EBAA did a great session on this yesterday, which didn't come up in my calendar, which I'm kicking myself for, on a similar one. It's saying one of the things you need to think about there is cultural influence on transactions. Do you want to comment on that quickly?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things under the FCPA in terms of the recipients of gifts states that, I think this is what you're talking about, states that it's not just giving gifts to the foreign, to the royal family member. It's giving gifts or an illegal bribe to somebody who can then peddle influence with those people. I believe that's what she means. And then from a wider perspective, it is sort of what I touched on earlier. And in particular, I like to give the example of something that's, cultures with deep-seated, deep-rooted traditions of gift giving just as part of business. Whether it's Guangxi or in China or it's WAFTA in the Middle East, what's considered the norm there is very much outside of the norm for companies that play in or come under these particular rules.
Paul, that's brilliant. What's your one piece of advice you'd give to anyone watching? And then I'm going to let you go to bed because it's almost midnight your time.
No, I'm going back to work, unfortunately. One piece of advice, my favorite piece of advice is just be advised and be aware, but really take, I think it's 18 minutes and watch that presentation from CGI 2019. And if you have any questions, call me or any other lawyers. Time on the phone is free, I always say. So, yeah.
I thought you had a charging line.
I do. That's the second one.
Brilliant. Paul, we'll share a link to your presentation. Great to see you. And the key takeaway is that the US Department of Justice never sleeps. Neither does Paul Jebley.
Apparently not. Thank you, Al. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Paul. Great to see you. We're now delighted to have Dimitri Kamslov from Debevoise and Plimpton. Dimitri is normally based in the firm's Moscow office, but he's coming to us from Spain at the moment. Dimitri, you're a finance specialist. You get involved in aviation finance, aircraft finance. But why do you also have to focus on sanctions so much?
It's very important to focus on sanctions in aviation transactions because the aircraft is such an asset which can fly all around the globe, including to countries that may be subject to US foreign policies. And the aircraft very often change hands. And there are so many market participants that you may find yourself exposed to sanction risks from many angles. In addition, the US, as most of you know, has extensive export controls, and aircraft and the aviation industry as such is the industry which may contain dual-use equipment, and the aircraft is a very important asset on which the regulators place particular supervision, and that as a result, the magnitude of penalties that people may face for violating sanctions is enormous, and the fines that have been out there can be in terms of billions of dollars. So it's very important to be wary of sanctions restrictions in the aviation area, in particular in the business jet area.
When I asked Paul a similar question, but when I look at OFAC website, I see massive settlements. CETA had a several $billion-dollar one for dealing with Iranian airlines. There was one this week for Schlumberger. Do OFAC and the other entities that are involved in the sanctions in the US government care much more about large companies?
It actually doesn't matter at all. It is very, the OFAC exercises significant authority, and given that the currency is usually, the transaction currency in aviation deals is dollars, it's very likely that inappropriate transactions are going to be detected. And there have been cases where not only large corporates were liable for violating sanctions, but also smaller ones, like some enterprises in the US that have rendered services to some of Russian sanctioned entities. So it doesn't mean that if you're a small, I don't know, operator or an aircraft owner, OFAC will not be looking after you. It's not exactly. It's not correct.
So I think everyone here is familiar with Iran and sanctions in Iran and Russia. Belarus is getting a lot of action at the moment, including from the UK government sanctions, I think 8 aircraft there. What are the key areas that people should be worried about? And also, when you look at a lot of the Iranian sanctions cases, there was no obvious link to Iran when the deal first took place, was there?
Yeah, that's right. And Iran and the other countries that are subject to so-called countrywide sanctions are the primary areas of concern. I appreciate that the aircraft, not the business jets, not very often fly to such kind of areas like Iran, Cuba, North Korea, and others. But in our practice in Europe, it is very often that people care and ask questions about Crimea. Many business jet owners, Russian owners, are asking questions whether it's possible or it's allowed to operate aircraft there. And there are certain restrictions imposed by U.S. government by OFAC on export of U.S. manufactured equipment to Crimea. But there are certain exemptions under which an aircraft can actually operate to Crimea as a matter of U.S. law. It's more complicated with European sanctions, but it's kind of an area where we receive many questions about.
Okay, we've got a great question from the audience, and someone's making it. They've done this. Not only have they asked it anonymously, but their first line is, "Dimitri, I want some free advice." So I think they want to make it clear that they're not paying. Dimitri, you mentioned that sanctions must be completed from multiple angles. How far beyond the initial parties to a transaction must one diligence the potential users of funds and the aircraft in order to comply with the various sanctions regimes? Do provisions covering the use of proceeds and the aircraft provide an absolute defense to liability for the breach of sanctions? And I can answer the second part is no, there's been cases, but I'll let you answer it properly.
Yeah, that's right. It's very important to trace the use of funds and the use of aircraft through the very end, to the end user and to end beneficiary of the transaction. And the answer in second part of the question is it's not sufficient to only have contractual or kind of restrictions in place that prohibit inappropriate transactions. It's very important to actually monitor that these requirements are actually being complied with. And in one of the cases that have been out there, I think this very question was actually flagged, that it's not sufficient to have restrictions. You have to actually police them.
But if I look at that case, it was one where it was engines, wasn't it? Where they were leased to one airline, but then leased them onto another one in Sudan, which was subject to a ban.
Exactly.
What happens if you're involved in a transaction
Exactly.
and from the start it looks completely clean and you've done your due diligence and you've got your documentation? What do you do if you realize you've inadvertently helped someone breach sanctions? Do I call a lawyer first before I call OFAC?
Yeah, this is exactly what you should be doing. Actually, putting jokes aside, the first what you should do is to evaluate whether whether the breach is actually there, and to figure it out. It's important to engage with competent lawyers who will be able to advise you whether there is a problem or not. After that, there is no solution that fits everyone. It is very individual case. It depends on many aspects that may be out there. But obviously, if you with your advisors come to a conclusion that there might indeed be a violation of sanctions, it might be prudent to report actually the violation to OFAC. OFAC considers so-called self-reporting as one of the mitigating factors, and that is why if you actually report violation, take measures for this not to happen in the future, it should be possible. It might be possible to reach a settlement. In addition to that, OFAC, in our experience, is a regulator that is actually open and engages in dialogue. And if in our practice, with certain clients, we can contact OFAC on a non-name basis, and it's actually possible to do it. And OFAC does reply, does engage into discussions, and it may be possible to, if the situation is not black and white, it may be possible to discuss with OFAC whether there is actually something to worry about, or this may be, taken, or OFAC may decide to take a more relaxed approach if this is not kind of the primary area of OFAC's enforcement focus. In addition, obviously, it should be possible to, in certain circumstances, it is possible to apply for a license from OFAC to conduct certain activities with restricted persons.
And I should have spelled it out first. OFAC is the...
And finally, I think...
Sorry, you go, Dimitri. Sorry.
Finally, you have already mentioned that. Yes, sorry about that. You have already mentioned it, but I wanted to reiterate that it is indeed important to have sanctions policies and procedures aimed to detect and prevent transactions with parties that may be subject to sanctions, whether that's blocking sanctions or sectoral sanctions and things like that. This is something that most of our clients, at least large corporates, do have.
I should have spelled it out at the start. OFAC is the Office of Foreign Assets Control, which is part of the US Department of the Treasury. But also it's worth remembering there's about another 10 or another 9 sanctions lists, aren't there, that you should be aware of in the US alone. Dimitri, everyone should be aware of all the other lists as well, shouldn't they? Like the BIS list and it's not just OFAC they should worry about.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. There are different lists and different kinds of sanctions. And going beyond the US, as everyone is aware, European Union has similar sanctions in place. And after Brexit, the UK also has now its own sanctions framework, which is broadly consistent with the US in the areas that we aviators usually come across with, but with some particularities.
I was trying to avoid talking about Brexit, but one of the things the UK has brought out in the last few months is it's now started sort of crossing over with the subject that Paul was talking about, where the UK is now also sanctioning individuals for bribery and corruption, which means there's even more names going on the list. Do you see that sanctions lists are just growing and growing? It's a growing area of concern. Should everyone be more worried about it now than, say, 10 years ago?
Oh, yes, absolutely. The policy of the US over the last years years have been increasing, and there are reports out there that U.S. Congress have been considering further sanctions, at least against Russia. So it doesn't seem that the end is near.
No, and also the US is starting to warn against sanctions against Chinese entities as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
Dimitri, thank you so much for joining us. That was brilliant. Thanks so much.
No problem. My pleasure. Thanks very much for inviting. Bye.
That's great to have Dimitri Kamslov from Debevoise and Plimpton, and also before him, Paul Jebley from Pillsbury. We're now going to switch to the US and have Scott McCreary from McAfee and Taft and David Hernandez for Vedder Price. If you are interested in sanctions, we have today launched a new product, Semaphore Intel, that allows you to search sanctions lists, and you can see the list down below. And if you'd like more information on that, please let us know. Scott, how are you?
I'm great, Al. How are you this morning?
Very well, thank you. It looks like sunny outside in Oklahoma City.
It is.
And David, great to see you in Washington, D.C., coming to us from Vedder Price. How are you?
Doing well. Ready for another exciting day in D.C.
It's always exciting in D.C.
Right.
Well, less exciting now than it was a year ago.
And that's, well, I shouldn't say it's a good or bad thing. Yes, it is. I confirm that. It's very boring right now, which is great.
So we've looked at OFAC, we've looked at sanctions, we've looked at corruption sanctions. Scott, what do you think people on the call should be thinking about for external risks at the moment?
Well, I think I think the goal for everyone is to avoid entering into or getting involved with the transaction that might be subject to sanctions, right? So, in the words of Frank Polk, I remember he used to always say, you can have a deal done fast, you can have it done cheap, and you can have it done right. You can only have 2 out of 3, right? So if you want it done fast and cheap, it's not going to be done right. So parties need to, understand that, and up front, take the time and do the due diligence to vet the parties, understand what's going on, and identify any possible issues early.
Do you think people are taking it more seriously now?
Absolutely.
David, you're getting a lot of comments about your tie and nice glasses.
There we go. I just put these on 10 minutes ago, so give me a little credit. No, I think risks are always going to be there. I think what's happening now, and what a lot of people don't realize what's happening, is at least with the trust stuff and BIS, they're really ramping it up now. And what's happening, I think, is they're coordinating with the FAA. Specifically, we had a client the end of August, BIS, Paul Mack, and a team of folks from the FAA met with him in their office to discuss some filings with an aircraft being exported to Central America. And they said you weren't a target of a criminal investigation, but they're asking a bunch of questions about the registration of the aircraft, which this is unheard of, having the BIS and the FAA actually meet you in their offices during COVID. And 3 days after the meeting, they issued a seizure letter. Well, the seizure letter was actually dated before the meeting, so they'd already planned to seize the aircraft. But the fact of the matter is, the risks are real because BIS is now coordinating their actions with the FAA. And this all goes back to what happened with aircraft guarantee. BIS realizes the integral role that the FAA plays with all of these transactions and the exports. And what's happening simultaneously is that BIS is now investigating, as I think I said in the earlier webinar, up to 8,000 aircraft, if not more, right now. And people don't realize that. They're de facto seizing these planes, meaning they're locking them in place before anybody knows about it. And all the trust companies are dealing with this right now. Their aircraft are being investigated. Lenders probably don't realize it, but all this is happening right now. And no one wants to publicize it because it's not good news. it's not cheery news. It's not cheerful. So that's the risk that I think that folks ought to focus on is, what they don't know is probably more concerning than compliance. I think, no, I shouldn't say this. Compliance is always important, and that never stops. But people need to be concerned about what's not happening and what they don't know about, because that's what's going to sneak up on you.
I realize we're using a lot of abbreviations today. BIS is Bureau of Industry and Security, isn't it?
Correct.
Which is not actually something that really has ever been on the radar, apart from they have some sanctions, I guess. But in aviation, it's not been something we've worried about, is it, David?
It really hasn't, because, and that's the problem, frankly. I mean, they're just the export folks, but they are the enforcement arm for Census Bureau. And Census doesn't have their own enforcement. They defer everything to the BIS folks or the Office of Export Enforcement. And those are folks that have, very, very little or no sense of humor. Everything's serious to them. And, they will make your life miserable. And, I literally had a talk me off the ledge session with a client. Go, what's going on here? What happened? Why are they seizing my plane? And I explained to him step by step what the roles are. And it's a very difficult and unenviable position to be in when you're in it. And so avoid it, avoid it, pre-plan, talk to folks that know what they're doing, because BIS is now, this whole 8 aircraft guarantee thing, you've kicked a sleeping bear, and they're on a roll, and they're not going to stop until they're done. Whatever done looks like, it's hard to say.
And we've got a question from Terry Sprees. David, are the FAA investigating historic transactions as well as current ones? There is a statute of limitations, isn't there?
There's a statute of limitations, but no, the FAA is not that I'm aware of investigating historic. I mean, historic beyond 5 years. They got enough transactions to deal with right now. This is driven in large part by the BIS checking for fraudulent exports and fraudulent filings, whether it's little things that before brokers and others could get away with. But for example, signing a declaration of international operations as a broker when you're selling the plane and you're not the owner. Owners are supposed to sign declaration of international operations. And for folks on the line or international, whenever you fly an aircraft outside the United States, immediately after closing, you have to file for this special authorization. And it has to be the owner of the aircraft, the registered owner. And what happened in my situation is the person that was the seller signed it on behalf of the new owner, who was a Mexican owner, and not good. It's not a good result. And so pre-plan, talk to professionals, but also understand that there are serious consequences if you don't manage risks for financiers, for OEMs, for everybody involved in the pipeline. And that's one of the things that Eddie and I have always been kicking around. I mean, been kicking around a lot in the last few weeks, is how to manage the risk for financiers who have no clue what's going on. A lot of these aircraft that I deal with that are in trouble are financed. And, you talk to the borrower and they ask, well, should we tell the lender? Oh, hell no. We're not going to tell anybody yet. And so those are the issues that people on the other side, that they just don't know what they don't know at this point.
Scott, do you want to talk about exports?
Sure. I mean, so I agree with a lot of what David said, if not all of it. But, just kind of looking at the big picture with the aircraft guarantee Wright brothers scenario, I mean, that's like a perfect storm of bad facts, right? And it did cause and has caused, a lot of focus and scrutiny from the government about all the branches you could think of, but especially BIS, and so that there's been a focus there. But, one of the primary issues with that scenario in the BIS is that the industry just didn't really understand the rules. They didn't really understand the export rules and how BIS wanted those to happen. And so now that we better understand them, people like David and other people who do that type of work all the time on current transactions can walk everyone through how to do them safely. And not only can David do that and others, but it's everyone wants to. Like the information that the BIS wants or wanted in the forms and filings that you need to make, and even when it comes to aircraft registration, none of that information on legitimate transactions is anything that anyone ever wanted to hide. You know, everyone would comply. They're more than willing to comply. They just didn't really understand the ground rules. And so for deals going forward, I think, you know, kind of like when I said earlier, you know, people need to take the time to do the due diligence. And aircraft transactions are complex for all kinds of different reasons, and this is an added complexity that people didn't focus on as much before, right? You always had tax, you always had operational issues, you always had sanctions of some sort, and now you've got these customs filings and questions about trust and, you know, the validity of the information that's been submitted to the FAA, like on the declarations of international operations. Well, there's a new focus on those, but we've always wanted to comply with that. I mean, in legitimate deals. And so, you know, I think clients are complying with that. I think they should feel comfortable that they're complying with it if they've taken the time to look at it and hire the right people to help them. And then, you know, as David said, you know, who knows on some of the past violation types of things, you know, what's going to happen there. And certainly it's all being looked into, and you know, we just don't know yet. But for deals going forward, I think we know how to do them. We know what to look for, and people can be comfortable that they're complying with U.S. requirements.
Yeah.
The thing which scares me about the export side on the following the aircraft guarantee case, Scott, is following on from what you've just said, is that no one was doing it deliberately. It was one of those things that you export an aircraft, you think you've done the deal, you don't have to worry about it now, and then it comes back to bite you. Is there anything else out there we should be worried about?
Yeah, who knows? I mean, not that I'm aware of, but you know, you never know with the government. There's always something new every day, and administrations change, and the way they look at things change, and so, you know, you definitely have to keep your finger on the pulse.
Yeah, and also don't. I mean, it's as crazy as it may sound. Read the documents. Understand what you're signing, because every document you submit to the government has the potential to be a fraud or a false statement allegation. And the folks that I've seen that get in trouble are the ones that don't read the documents. If, for example, if you're supposed to sign something and the document says the owner needs to sign this, it's a simple question. Are you the owner? Well, no, I sold it. Well, then you can't sign it. But I just want to do a favor for my bud who just bought the plane. But you're not the owner. You can't sign it. Well, they're in Colombia, and it's really hard for them to come up with COVID, and they really can't inspect the plane. I want to help them out. That's such easy seizure red flag. It's just so easy for the government to seize these planes. And think about the lack of due process. So the government seizes your aircraft. You're based internationally, and for the folks that are on the call from international destination or, you know, outside the U.S., it's an awful process. It's an awful process, a seizure from the U.S. government, because, you know, it's very complicated, even for the folks that do it regularly, and they make it extremely difficult. So, and I tell clients, you might as well just give up the plane unless it's worth a lot of money, because it's such an awful process. And there are folks that do it, but to litigate these things from start to finish is so expensive, and the government knows that. It's just laughing. And what you know, to put a cherry and some whipped cream on top, the government special agents get a cut of the fines or the seizures. So when they seize it, oh, they absolutely do. I'll send you a list of how it works. So they get a small percentage of the seizure, their office. And it's just, there is an incentive to seize aircraft under the circumstances. And, but that's the process. They're following the law. You know, it's not the government's fault that people didn't get in trouble. And as Scott said, if you do it correctly, you won't get in trouble, period. There's no gotchas there about, oh man, you tricked me. I'm not the owner, but you thought I was. that just hire folks to do it. And I tell clients, always hire reputable title companies, folks in Oklahoma City that know what they're doing and look at the documents and understand the process, because you don't want to turn an inadvertent mistake into an intentional violation.
That's a good rule on life. We've got a question from David Mayer, who I'm sure knows the answer. Scott, I'll go to you. What reaction do lenders and lessors have, or should have, should a borrower or lessee encounter an enforcement action? Will that include defaulting the transaction and demanding repayment of the loan within a prescribed period of time?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's like, I think David Mayer knows the answer to that one more than I do, but it depends on the commercial terms of your deal and what the relationship is between the lender and the debtor and how comfortable they are with everything. So, I mean, look, again, I think just follow on what David said just a little bit. The industry's always been really good about self-policing when we understood what the rules were. And that's what we're doing. I mean, they're and to the government's defense, I mean, they're just trying to do their job, right? And there are a very small number of deals, and I think it's small comparatively to the overall transaction load on the United States Registry, but there are a small number of deals where people didn't act appropriately. And unfortunately, those transactions are kind of highlighted. And, we want to avoid the government legislating to the lowest common denominator, right? I mean, we don't want them putting rules in place to deal with these very few one-off bad transactions that, hey, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know the Declaration of International Operations says it's supposed to be signed by the owner. If you're not the owner and you sign that document, you shouldn't, number one, and no one should file it, number two. So the industry needs to focus on those things, self-police. I don't think that, the sky is not falling on these transactions, but, we do need to find out what's going to happen, on some of the investigations and enforcement actions that are pending.
Yeah.
David, did you want to comment? I guess the problem is if you're a foreign borrower who gets an aircraft seized, do you want to bother paying the bank back?
I mean, it's a situation where let's start from, and I'll use a real world scenario. One, like I said earlier, do you want to tell the bank? How does the bank know it's been seized? I've got a couple aircraft right now with clients that they're not formally seized, but they can't sell them. They can't, BIS will not release them. And so that's, in my mind, a de facto seizure. They said, we don't care what you do with it. You just can't sell it. You can't do anything with it. So, and they may or may not be financed. So the question becomes, do you tell the bank? No one's going to do that. They don't have, they're not going to. But it ultimately goes back to what do the loan documents provide and what's a seizure? And that's something that, is unclear whether you're a lessor or a borrower, a lessee or a borrower. It all depends on what your loan docs. But there's a lot of just gray area here that no one really wants to address because the answers may be bad answers that could make lenders look like, hey, I never prepared for that, or I didn't think about that, or this whole aircraft guarantee and the enforcement of increased enforcement of BIS is really going to force lenders, lessors to take a hard look at their loan and lease docs to make sure these types of things are covered, because they're not covered right now in large part. People like to think they are, and everyone thinks, oh, my documents are the greatest in the world. Well, there's always issues, and there's always new things that we don't know about. And is there going to be something else in the next few years? Possibly. But this is the new hot thing that BIS is locked onto like a pit bull on a bone, and they're not giving up. They will not give up. And, I don't see an end to this in the near future. It's too easy, and it looks too good on their resumes to enforce this, because frankly, it's just something that has not been happening over the last 10 years.
Got a great question from Sylvie Perron. Is this a consequence? Is this a direct consequence of what happened with aircraft guarantee, or was this scrutiny coming along all the time? Scott?
I think I think it was out there. They were starting to look into. I mean, look, they focused on their issue primarily has been it's hard to comply with their treaty requirements and oversight requirements for U.S. registered aircraft based outside the United States. I mean, it's just physically and practically difficult to do that. So that issue's been out there for years. I mean, there's the enforcement team within the FAA, the customs folks. I mean, it's always been an issue. That when non-citizen trust issues came up, 10 years ago, that was kind of the focus. I mean, the reason why it was focused on. But absolutely, I think that the AGC, Wright brothers issue certainly lit a fire under this, and it's pushed it to a new level.
Yeah, I think before this, BIS, or at least the agents, had no, I shouldn't say had no clue. They just assumed that the industry was doing what they were supposed to do. And right after this indictment came out, and even before that, when some of our aircraft were unable to be released from AGC, I had discussions with folks at BIS, and they said, "Do you realize this is happening?" Like, my question to them was, "No, but I did. But do you realize what's happening? That's the bigger picture. I'm not the government enforcement folks here. You guys are." And this has been a massive education process. And now my inbox, I've got a little BIS folder on my computer. It's packed with information that I keep getting from the folks at BIS saying, "Here's some more guidance, send this out. Here's some more stuff." Because they want everybody to comply. But the problem is that people aren't. And whether it's a lack of transparency, intentional indifference, it's got to happen. Folks have to follow the rules, or you're going to face the consequences.
We've got a great comment from Janine Inarelli saying the industry needs to embrace transparency. And then Charles Rees has gone, it's not so much transparency. The fact is you have to do your job and make sure you have done everything you can to make your liability as low as possible. It's not fun to read a contract, but it is worth it. Do you agree with both of them?
I do, absolutely. And I think that we're seeing that, over the last year for sure. It used to be we would ask for due diligence information, KYC, this, that, and the other. And, if depending on who's involved, you would get, screamed at, or, no one would want to do it. You're slowing the deal down, let's don't do it. And that's all changed. So everyone, especially the people that the real players in the industry, everyone's supportive of identifying providing the information, identifying any issues early, and addressing them. So yeah, I agree with them.
Yeah, and again, transparency, but even the concept of transparency, people interpret that different ways, right? And so transparency to BIS is not necessarily transparency to a broker doing a back-to-back deal who wants to rush it through and get paid. And so that's the sliding scale, the gray area. I agree completely. Read the documents, understand what you're signing, and don't be a pal and help somebody out who's you just sold a plane to. And I'll give you a classic example. This COVID issue has really hampered ability for international crews to come and check out planes, pick them up, fly them away. And temporary flight permits with the FAA do expire. And so that adds another layer where the international person may say, look, I can't, it's so difficult dealing with the FAA broker in the US who sold me the plane. Can you help me out? All of these things add another layer of complexity that cause people to make mistakes, or intentionally or indifferently. But transparency is obviously important, but it's also reading the documents.
Scott, going back to you can do a deal either fast, cheap, or right. We're in a hottest pre-owned market. Paul mentioned this earlier, that anyone's ever seen. Do you worry that everyone's focusing on fast?
Yes.
Yeah.
That was a straight answer. David?
Yeah, absolutely. I said earlier, everyone says, "Oh, hey, speed kill," or time kills deals, and an indictment kills deals, a seizure order kills deals.
Actually, technically, it doesn't kill the deal. The deal's closed.
Right. Well, I mean, some of those things.
It's also it's not just regulatory issues. The other thing that kills deals with the speed of the transaction, it's just misunderstandings between the parties. Like, especially if it's a back to back or whatever, everyone can do those deals right. We know how to do them, but the parties are going so fast that they don't understand what's going on. And especially our clients on whatever end, a lot of them don't do aircraft deals every day like we do. So a lot of this is new. It takes time for them to digest the advice and understand the risk and the process involved. And so that's, that type of speeding through the deal. I mean, we're all trying to close them, like you said, because the market's so hot and we want to close everything by Thursday, and we're all staying up late to do it. But it's not a lot of times that the brokers or the lawyers are not doing their job. It's just clients can't wrap their mind around the information that quickly.
I remember in sort of 2009, 2010, there was a theory that in times of sudden change, when the market turns bad, you get people are desperate and you get to see more people pushing the line, people pushing the boundaries, people trying harder to because they're starving. But actually, when markets are full of deals, you get the same thing, don't you?
The froth. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's I see it now. It's crazy. I've walked away from, I should say, I've advised clients to walk away from 2 deals recently because the sellers wouldn't allow simple things like inspections or borescopes. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Well, someone else will buy it. Good. Some idiot will buy it. But if you're not going to allow us to do an inspection, then so be it. But it's things like this. Don't let irrational times force you to make irrational decisions. I mean, you still need to think about what you're doing and how you're spending the money. Scott and I will laugh at this. I mean, I wish some clients would look at their documents they're signing as closely as they look at our invoices, our legal invoices, right? I mean, come on, read the agreements, understand what you're doing.
It's because your invoices are much more creative.
I mean, it's compared to some of these deals, they're pretty simple. Yeah.
We've got a debate going on between Eddie Gross and David Mayer. I wouldn't say debate, they're agreeing with each other about event of loss in revolt of a seizure and a reputation legal risk to Lind as lessors, which actually it's a great point. Reputation risk is very high in this. And then we've got a quick comment from Eddie saying borrowers and lessees need to promise they'll comply and cause compliance with laws, regulation, etc. And any breach of that is a default. I think that they're actually agreeing with each other here.
That's scary.
I know, it's great. We're all coming together.
But let me add this. My point on this, though, the lenders and the lessors do not know what's happening. There are planes that are seized, de facto seizures right now, and they don't know because we don't know how to resolve it because we're in this murky area of how the process works. You have to basically sue the government. You have to sue BIS to make a decision as to what is the basis for holding our aircraft hostage in the Aircraft Guarantee Trust. Now, who wants to sue the government under those circumstances?
Which is a great point because Ronnie Frank has just asked what complications, if any at all, are to be expected when buying an aircraft that is currently registered to ACG to pass clean title.
I mean, so they can't make a decision. Aircraft Guarantee can't make a decision unless it's approved by the Department of Justice and the BIS. So, I mean, that's pretty straightforward. I don't think there's any issue with that. It's not in the hands of aircraft guarantee at this point. It's all what's happening behind the scenes. And frankly, we don't know what we don't know. So when BIS says an aircraft is under further review or is being processed, like, well, shit, it's been 8 months. What's going on? Those are the things we don't know. And that's what's frustrating. It's really frustrating for a client who wants to sell an aircraft that's stuck in this quagmire.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not aware of, if you buy an aircraft that was registered under Aircraft Guarantee Trust, and as David said, if they're authorized to release the documents and file the documents, they'll sell forward. I'm not aware of a scenario where they've, come back and said, oh, well, but yet we're still looking at this. Doesn't mean it hasn't happened, but I'm not aware of it. But, also, it's not Aircraft Guarantee that's warranting title. I mean, really, if you're just getting a warranty from Aircraft Guarantee, you need to understand you're getting a warranty from just a company that doesn't really exist. You need to be looking to the beneficiary, to stand behind the warranties and titles, things like that. So people need to make sure that they're getting the right documents for the deal.
Great. Paul Jebley's just said borrowers have to disclose such circumstances to their lenders. I think he's talking about seizures, but they don't know that my mortgage company doesn't know I'm running a nightclub for a seller. So it's I don't see the difference. Scott, let's end on a cheery note. Of the 20,000 plus business jets flying, very few will be subject to sanctions or get seized or taken up. Apart from general counsel, what other advice would hiring a good counsel, i.e. one of you guys or Dimitri or Paul or other lawyers, Kerry and David and Eddie, and I can see you watching, and I shouldn't have started that because I'll have offended someone I've missed off. But what other advice would you give to people? Not to go too fast, Scott.
Yeah, I think, but I think really the most important hire other than lawyers, but the most important hire in the deal is the broker. I mean, a good broker, a good, knowledgeable, reputable broker just makes the transaction run so smoothly. They've got most of the time they have the real client contact with the pilots and everything that's going on, and they have a breadth of knowledge about the deal. And so if it's a good, knowledgeable, reasonable broker, that will make the deal run so much more smoothly.
Yeah, I agree. Brokers, they're brokering the deal. And I get so frustrated from my perspective as legal counsel in the deal. And the client keeps asking me about, how's the pre-buy going? I don't know. I'll ask the broker, various things. Those are things that the brokers should be informing and keeping. We should be working as a team. And the brokers that are missing in action, or again, moving to their next deal before they even close on our deal, the brokers are the ones that are quarterbacking this, and they need to be actively involved. And I think the second issue is be aware of conflicts, potential conflicts that may arise. Ask the question, is there a relationship with my broker and your broker? Is there a relationship with my broker and the seller of the aircraft? Understand potential conflicts of interest, because those ultimately will result in, or may result in, problematic issues, either down the road or after closing or just before closing.
I don't think anyone can argue that the secret is have a good lawyer and have a good broker, and try and get a lawyer and broker that get on with each other.
Right.
Thanks so much, Scott.
Thank you.
No.
Thank you.
Thanks, David. That was David Hernandez from Vedder Price, Scott McCreary from McAfee and Taft. Thank you very much to Paul Jebley from Pillsbury and Dimitri Kamslov from Debevoise and Plimpton. We very pleased you joined us. Please join us in a next week, where we're going to be looking at getting deals done, not going too fast, and how to get things closed for the end of the year. And also, please check out our new product, Semaphore Intel, which is designed to help everyone involved in the industry look out for threats and bad actors. You can see it there. And if you'd like a trial or like to see it, please let us know. But it's semaphorintel.com. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, good night, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
For nearly 60 years, clients have returned to Jetcraft because of our proven results in aircraft sales, acquisitions and trades. Our team of experts span the globe, providing local insight for every stage of your transaction. We have one of the largest and most diverse inventories in the industry, and with our worldwide network and industry connections, we are the difference between getting an aircraft and getting your aircraft.
Three, two, one.